Welcome back to MLL 400, the literature of travel in the 20th century. Today's module is dedicated to Anna Seghers and her novel Transit. Now, where had we left off last week? We had discussed, of course, the Chinese writer Xu Xu, and we had completed our module by talking a little bit about the importance of visas or visa, and specifically transit visas. And we had talked about the Japanese vice consul in Lithuania, who was called Sugihara Chiune. This man had issued during World War II several thousand transit visas to Jewish residents of Lithuania and Jewish refugees from German-occupied Poland and Soviet-occupied Poland. And many of these actually ended up in Shanghai by way of Japan. So today's module really is about the idea of travel as an involuntary act, traveling as a means of exile. The image here is actually from a passport of somebody who had received a visa from Sugihara Chiune. So here you actually see the name Sugihara, and then here of course you have the stamp of the Consulate of Japan, Consulat du Japon. And here it says transit visa for journey through Japan by way of Curaçao and other Netherlands colonies. And of course here, right, this is interesting. So this is a stamp, and this one given in Japan, right? This one says Nyukoku Tokyo, right? This is sort of entering the country, and this is the stamp for the actual transit visa, the Tsuka Tokyo. And then this one, I think, is probably a stamp, a transit visa for the Soviet Union. Now, I'm always fascinated by documents like this. Here is another passport. So this is actually a passport. This is the wartime passport of Xu Xu, right? Our author from last week. So it says the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of China requests all civil and military authorities of foreign states to let pass freely Mr. Xu. Remember that he actually called himself Xu Xu instead of Xu Xu, right? Going to USA via India, Iraq, Egypt, South Africa, Brazil, and all British and American ports. And then here actually is the transit visa, right? It says visa for proceeding to United States, good for direct transit through India, and if transshipment necessary through South Africa or Australia, etc., etc. And then here you have stamps from the various ports through which he passed. Now for today's class, we have to take a few steps back and also travel to Europe again. So we find ourselves in 1933, which is right just about the time when Langston Hughes passed through Berlin. Remember, we talked about that. And Hitler had just risen to power with his Nazi party. And shortly after they assumed power, the brutal prosecution of various political and ideological opposition figures of the Nazis begins. So the first are really the communists, and you might have learned in your history classes about the burning of the Reichstag, right, the seat of the German parliament, which the Nazis tried to blame the communists for, and most historians think that it was actually a setup now. But here you have a newspaper from 1933 that announces, "Jetzt wird rücksichtslos durchgegriffen. Enough is enough. Now we will take rigorous steps," and the communists are singled out. In addition, works of writers and artists critical of the regime are deemed un-German or degenerate, publicly burned, right? That's mostly books in 1933, and then later, artworks are removed from museums. So you have a newspaper clipping here from I think it's from maybe the New York Times. German students burned thousands of banned books. And then here on the right, you have a photo from an exhibition that displayed these so-called degenerate works of art. And you have a slogan up here that says, So sehen sie die Welt. Das machen die Meisterwerke. So that's how they see the world, right? In quotation marks, making fun of these artists. That's what they call masterworks. And you can see those paintings, right? Those are expressionist paintings. You remember we spent some time talking about expressionists like Max Pechstein, right? These artists were suddenly considered degenerate. And of course, there was the intensifying discrimination against German Jews that culminates in 1938 in the very violent anti-Semitic attacks of the so-called Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass. You have a newspaper clipping here from the San Francisco Chronicle. Germans storm Jews, wreck stores, burn synagogues. And of course, we know that this discrimination would only intensify and ultimately lead to the systematic murder of Jews. Now, all of these events then lead to an exodus of Germans from all walks of life to various countries. So there are Jews who leave the country, right? We talked about some of that last week. Those Jews who managed to get to Shanghai, some went to Palestine, some went to America. Communists, some of them went to Moscow, others went to France or other European countries. Writers, many famous writers, Thomas and Heinrich Mann, went to America, maybe just the two most famous. Stefan Zweig, another very famous writer, also Jewish, went to Brazil. And then, of course, there's Anna Seghers, the topic of today's module. And she was both Jewish and a communist, and she ended up in Mexico. Now, but even for those few lucky ones who managed to leave Germany in time, obtaining the right visa became a real struggle, as we will see today. Now, over previous weeks, we already talked a lot about Japanese imperialism and how that imperialism eventually paved the road to war, right? And in 1937, war breaks out, really full-scale war, when Japan invades China. Now, in 1939, war also becomes imminent in Europe, when Hitler and Stalin, or Molotov and Ribbentrop, their respective foreign ministers, sign a non-aggression pact and essentially divide Poland up between them. And as a result, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland, and the UK and France, that were allies of Poland, declare war on Germany. And subsequently, Nazi Germany conquers much of continental Europe. It forms an Axis alliance with Italy and also Japan. We talked a little bit about that last week. And in 1940, it eventually invades first the Benelux states, that is the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and then later on France. And you have a map here, and you can see, right, this is Germany and Italy, and then here you have territories in the east that are annexed by Germany, and then here in the west, the Benelux, France. And France is then later divided into a northern part that is directly under control of Germany, and a southern part that is under control of the Vichy regime. And again, we've talked a little bit about that before when we talked about Paul Morand. The Vichy regime was a collaborationist government and collaborated with the Nazis, and it was from Vichy that the French colonies in North Africa, in Morocco, Algeria, and Libya are essentially administered. Now, one of the places in Free France, or in North Africa, that I want you all to remember is the city of Casablanca, here in Morocco, because we will talk about that more today. Now, you might also notice that, right, we have here some yellow spots in Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Sweden, Turkey. These were neutral nations that had not joined the war, but of course we do know also from last week that Spain, of course, was somewhat aligned with Italy and Germany. Those refugees who had left Germany in the wake of the rise to power of Hitler, and who had sought refuge in the Netherlands or Belgium or Luxembourg or France, now these refugees suddenly found themselves on the run again. And where did their eyes turn towards? Well, many of their eyes turned towards the American continent. There was the USA, Canada, but there was also Mexico and Southern and Latin America. You've probably all heard about this movie Casablanca, one of the most famous movies ever made. And what is interesting is that this movie that was completed in 1942 was really one of the first Hollywood movies that made the struggle of refugees, the struggle to obtain visas, a topic in popular culture and elevated it to public discourse. Now, if you've never watched Casablanca, you should absolutely watch it. I put a link on iLearn, but I also want to show you a few clips because so much of what happens in Casablanca is so central to our module today and to our novel, namely the struggle to obtain the right visa.
With the coming of the Second World War, many eyes in imprisoned Europe turned hopefully or desperately toward the freedom of the Americas. Lisbon became the great embarkation point, but not everybody could get to Lisbon directly, and so a tortuous, roundabout refugee trail sprang up. Paris to Marseille, across the Mediterranean to Oran, then by train or auto or foot across the rim of Africa to Casablanca in French Morocco. Here, the fortunate ones, through money or influence or luck, might obtain exit visas and scurry to Lisbon, and from Lisbon to the New World. But the others wait in Casablanca, and wait, and wait, and wait.
All officers. 2 German couriers carrying important official documents murdered on train from Oran. Murderer and possible accomplices headed for Casablanca. Round up all suspicious characters and search them for stolen document. Important.
So most of the story takes place inside a saloon that is run by an American in Casablanca called Rick, and here he is, and I want to show you another pivotal scene from inside the saloon.
May I? Too bad about those 2 German couriers, wasn't it?
They got a lucky break. Yesterday, they were just 2 German clerks. Today, they're honored dead.
You're a very cynical person, Rick, if you forgive me for saying so.
I forgive you.
Thank you. Will you have a drink with me, please?
No.
Oh, I forgot you never drink with any... I'll have another, please. Yes, monsieur. You despise me, don't you?
Well, if I gave you any thought, I probably would.
But why? Oh, you object to the kind of business I do, huh? But think of all those poor refugees who must rot in this place if I didn't help them. Well, that's not so bad. Through ways of my own, I provide them with exit visas.
For a price, Ugarte. For a price.
But think of all the poor devils who can't meet the nose price. Oh, I get it for them for half. Is that so parasitic?
I don't mind a parasite. I object to a cut-rate one.
Well, Rick, after tonight, I'll be through with the whole business, and I'm leaving, finally, this Casablanca.
Who's bribed for your visa? Renault or yourself?
Myself. Found myself much more reasonable. Look, Rick. You know what this is? Something that even you have never seen. Letters of transit signed by General Wegon. Cannot be rescinded, not even questioned. One moment. Tonight I'll be selling those for more money than even I have ever dreamed of. And then, adio, Casablanca. You know, Rick, I have many a friend in Casablanca, but somehow, just because you despise me, you are the only one I trust. Will you keep these for me, please?
For how long?
Oh, perhaps an hour, perhaps a little longer.
I don't want them here overnight.
Don't be afraid of that. Please keep them for me. Thank you. I knew I could trust you. Waiter, I'll be expecting some people. If anybody asks for me, I'll be right here.
Yes, monsieur.
Rick, I hope you're more impressed with me now. Huh?
Now, this being a Hollywood movie, there has to be, of course, a love story. And there has to be sacrifice and romance. And I don't want to spoil the story for you, but I'm going to show you one last little clip.
If you don't mind, you fill in the names. That'll make it even more official.
You think of everything, don't you?
And the names are Mr. and Mrs. Victor Laszlo.
But why my name, Richard?
Because you're getting on that plane.
I don't understand. What about you?
I'm staying here with him till the plane gets safely away.
No, Richard, no. What has happened to you? Last night
Last night we said a great many things. You said I was to do the thinking for both of us. Well, I've done a lot of it since then. It all adds up to one thing. You're getting on that plane with Victor where you belong.
But, Richard, no,
Now, you've got to listen to me. You have any idea what you'd have to look forward to if you stayed here? 9 chances out of 10, we'd both wind up at a concentration camp. Isn't that true, Louis?
I'm afraid Major Strasser would insist.
You're saying this only to make me go.
I'm saying it because it's true. Inside of us, we both know you belong with Victor. You're part of his work, the thing that keeps him going. If that plane leaves the ground and you're not with him, you'll regret it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon and for the rest of your life.
But what about us?
We'll always have Paris.
And again, I strongly urge you to watch the movie if you've never watched it. Casablanca, of course, is a Hollywood movie, and our novel, arguably, is a much truer and visceral and personal account of what it really meant to obtain the right visa. But before we plunge into our novel, let's talk a little bit about the author, Anna Seghers. Born 1900, lived until 1983. Anna Seghers was her pen name. She was born as Nettie Reiling into a prominent Jewish family in Germany. Her father was an art dealer. In 1924, she obtained a doctorate from the University of Heidelberg in art history. The next year, she got married to a Hungarian sociologist called Laszlo Radványi, who later called himself Johann Lorenz Schmidt, and who was a member of the Communist Party. In 1928, she herself joined the Communist Party. She later on traveled to the Soviet Union in the 1930s, and then around that time she also began her career as a writer, and she writes at first mostly socialist realist works. One of her first well-known novels, The Revolt of the Fishermen of Santa Barbara, is a novel about empowering workers and to encourage them to unionize and rise up against exploitative bosses, or, the structure of capitalism. As a result of all this, she is already in 1933 arrested by the Gestapo, which was the secret police of the Nazis. Gestapo is an acronym for Geheime Staatspolizei, secret state police, and her books are publicly burned. She then immigrates to Paris with her husband and her children, and in Paris she's quite active in the anti-fascist resistance. After the outbreak of war, her husband and many other Germans are actually interned in a camp because they suddenly would have, of course, been enemy aliens, because there has been a declaration of war. And many refugees were actually interned, and her husband, for example, found himself interned together with Arthur Koestler, right? You remember him. He's an old acquaintance of ours from the module on Langston Hughes, remember, a prominent communist. Leon Feuchtwanger, another German Jewish writer, a very famous writer. Now, in the meantime, Anna Seghers manages to reach Marseille, a port city in the south of France, and with the help of the Consul General of Mexico, Gilberto Bosch, she obtains visas to Mexico for herself and her family. And this Consul General, similar to the Japanese Vice Consul in Lithuania, provides visas to roughly 40,000 refugees and essentially saves their lives. So these experiences then, both of the internment of her husband and her struggle to obtain these visas, and the experience of having been a refugee, are really the basis for her novel Transit, that was published in 1944, probably written earlier than that. Around the same time, she also writes another novel called The Seventh Cross, Das Siebte Kreuz, which is published in abridged form in the US in 1942, and then later on also in German, Russian, Portuguese, Yiddish, and Spanish. It's a work that is set in the mid-1930s, and it's about a concentration camp and about 7 refugees who try to escape from that camp. Now, when she wrote this book, concentration camps were not yet quite what they later became. Prior to the outbreak of war, concentration camps were mostly camps where our opposition was interned, but they weren't yet the extermination camps that they later became and that we now usually associate with the term concentration camp, which is probably why the novel later lost some of its relevance, but at the time of its publication it was actually very well received and even turned into a Hollywood movie. And here are a couple of flyers from that movie. Now, one last word about Anna Seghers. After the war, she actually returned to Germany, and she decided to go to East Germany, right, the communist German post-war state, and she became one of the most important cultural figures in East Germany. And quite ironically, or rather sadly, because of the Cold War, many of her books weren't even published or made available to readers in West Germany, like, for example, the novel Transit, which was only published in the 1980s. And we will talk more about the novel Transit in our second course stream. So I will see you shortly.